Welcome back to another episode of Working Man's Guide to Documenting Web API Reference using OpenAPI 3.0 and VS Code. Now that we have gone through components of REST API URL, let's look at the various HTTP request methods that you could come across. HTTP request methods indicate the action that you want to perform on a given resource. Though they can be nouns, they are sometimes referred to as HTTP verbs. While there are 9 different types of HTTP request methods, we'll only look at 5 common methods. The first is the GET method. This method is used to retrieve data from the service provider. When you talk about HTTP request methods, I think it is only fair to talk about their idempotency property. Welcome back to another episode of Working Man's Guide to Documenting Web API Reference using OpenAPI 3.0 and VS Code. Now that we have gone through the components of REST API URL, let's look at the various HTTP request methods that you could come across. HTTP request methods indicate the action that you want to perform on a given resource. Though they can be nouns, they are sometimes referred to as HTTP verbs. While there are 9 different types of HTTP request methods, we'll only look at 5 common methods. Let's start with GET method. This method is used to retrieve data from the service provider. It is idempotent. When we talk about HTTP request methods, I think it is only fair to talk about their idempotency property. According to RFC 7231, a request method is considered idempotent if the intended effect on the server of multiple identical requests with that method is the same as the effect for a single such request. Meaning, if you were to send the same request multiple times, an idempotent method will not change the state of data. For that reason, GET is idempotent. Next, we have POST. POST is used to create a new resource. It is non-idempotent. A non-idempotent method like POST changes the state of data in the server. Meaning, if you were to send 2 identical POST requests, it will create 2 copies of data in the server. Then comes PUT method. This method is used to update the resource represented by the API URL. If the resource does not exist, this method will create the resource. This method is idempotent. Patch. This method is also used to update the resource represented by the API URL. However, unlike PUT method, if the resource does not exist, it will not create a new resource. This method might be non-idempotent depending on its implementation. Confusing? Let's look at an example to understand it better. Say you have a patch method that lets you add name property to a resource. The resource, however, can only have one name property. If you were to run the patch operation twice on the same resource, on the second run, the patch would attempt to add another name property to that same resource. This might result in a failure. This again depends on the type of implementation or the implementation that goes behind the API. I hope that was able to clear why patch could be idempotent. Now let's move on to the delete method. Delete is used to remove the resource represented by the API URL. This method is also idempotent. Well, this brings us to the end of the introduction series. I hope you were able to understand REST APIs, their types, the various HTTP methods, and the URL components. On our next episode, we'll talk about how to set yourself up for documenting REST APIs. Till then, stay safe.